So today we're looking at something that, if you're Australian, you can probably feel in your wallet, your commute, and your general will to live. We're talking about why Australians flee the East Coast. And I'm not talking about gray nomads doing a lap around the country in a caravan. I mean working-age people, families, young professionals, people who moved to Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane chasing the dream and then woke up one morning in a studio apartment they're paying $900 a week for and thought, what am I actually doing with my life? Here's what makes this interesting, though. It's not just about cost. Every expensive city in the world has people whinging about prices. What's happening on Australia's East Coast is more specific than that. There are structural, geographic, and psychological pressures here that are genuinely unique, things you don't get hit with in Perth, Adelaide, Hobart, or Darwin. And once you see them stacked up together, you start to understand why the exodus isn't just a trend, it's a rational response. So let's break down the 6 reasons the East Coast squeezes people out, even when they desperately want to stay. 1. Everything is crammed into one mega corridor. Australia is a massive continent, absolutely enormous. You could fit most of Western Europe inside it and still have room for a few car parks. But here's the thing, the vast majority of Australians live in one narrow corridor running from Brisbane down through Sydney to Melbourne. That's it. One strip, 3 cities, about 15 million people stacked on top of each other like a human lasagna. Now, think about what that does. You've got a huge chunk of the country's population, jobs, universities, and infrastructure all concentrated into this one mega corridor, and that creates intense, layered pressure that you just don't get anywhere else in Australia. Housing? 15 million people competing for homes in the same strip of coastline. Infrastructure? Roads, trains, hospitals, all groaning under the weight. Jobs? Yeah, they're here, but so is everyone else who wants them. Compare that to Perth, which sits on its own over in the west, doing its own thing with room to breathe, or Adelaide, which has genuinely good coffee and houses you can actually afford. The East Coast's problem isn't just that it's popular, it's that everything is concentrated into one corridor, and that corridor is absolutely heaving. 2. Coastal geography creates an artificial housing shortage. Now, here's the one that people massively underestimate, and it's probably the most uniquely East Coast problem on this list. Look at Sydney on a map. On one side, you've got the Pacific Ocean. Can't build on that. Well, not yet anyway. Give it time. On the other, the Blue Mountains, national parks, protected bushland, heritage areas, all beautiful, all important, and all completely unbuildable. So Sydney is literally boxed in. It's squeezed between the ocean and the mountains like a sandwich nobody ordered. There's nowhere left to expand outward, which means the only option is to build up or push people further and further into the outer suburbs, which, as we'll get to, creates its own nightmare. And it's not just Sydney. The entire East Coast runs on this pattern. Ocean on one side, ranges and protected land on the other. It's a geographic straitjacket. Now compare that to Perth. Perth's got the ocean on one side, sure, but on the other side, flat land, loads of it. Just kilometers and kilometers of, yeah, build whatever you want out here, mate. That's why Perth can sprawl. That's why housing supply can actually keep up with demand over there in a way that's physically impossible on the East Coast. So when people say, why is Sydney so expensive? Part of the answer is literally geology. The land ran out. And when the land runs out but the people keep coming, prices go one direction. Up. Always up. 3. Opportunity gravity pulls you in, then squeezes you. The East Coast has the jobs. It has the big companies, the headquarters, the career opportunities, the networking events, the lot. If you're ambitious and you want to climb the ladder in finance, tech, media, law, medicine, you're probably heading to Sydney or Melbourne. That's just how it works. The gravity of opportunity pulls you in. But here's the catch. Once you get there, you realize that everyone else had the same idea. You're now competing with thousands of other smart, hungry, qualified people for the same roles, the same promotions, the same rental properties, and the same overpriced parking spots. And the math starts to get ugly. Yeah, your salary might be higher on the East Coast. Maybe you're earning 120 grand in Sydney compared to 90 in Adelaide. But your rent is double. Your childcare costs more per day than some people's car repayments. Your commute eats 2 hours of your life every day. So you earn more, but you keep less. You have more career options, but less financial freedom. You're technically getting ahead on paper while actually falling behind in real life. It's like running on a treadmill that someone keeps tilting uphill. You're putting in more effort than ever, but the scenery isn't changing. And that's the paradox. The place with the most opportunity in Australia is also the hardest place to actually get ahead. Eventually, people do the sums, stare at their bank balance, and think, hang on a minute. 4. Commute culture is next-level brutal. Because housing near the actual city centers is reserved for millionaires and people who bought in 1987, everyone else gets pushed further and further out, and that means commutes. Long ones, soul-destroying ones. We're talking 60, 70, 90-minute commutes each way. That's not unusual on the East Coast. That's standard. People in Western Sydney spend 3 hours a day getting to and from work. 3 hours. That's 15 hours a week. That's roughly 32 full days a year spent on a train or stuck on the M4 watching your life dissolve through a windshield. And the public transport? Look, Melbourne's trams are iconic. They're lovely. They're on postcards. They're also packed to the rafters during peak hour and move at the speed of a pensioner browsing at Bunnings. Sydney's trains run late often enough that it's basically a cultural identity at this point. And Brisbane? Brisbane built toll tunnels, so now you can sit in traffic underground and pay $7 for the experience. In smaller cities and regional towns, this just doesn't exist. Your commute is 15 minutes, maybe 20 if you get stuck behind a tractor. You get home while there's still daylight. You eat dinner with your family instead of reheating leftovers at 9 p.m. while your kids are already asleep. It's a fundamentally different quality of life, and people are starting to choose it. 5. Climate and disasters add another layer of pressure. Now, as if the cost and the commute weren't enough, the East Coast has another trick up its sleeve. It's also one of the most disaster-prone corridors in the developed world. Northern New South Wales and Queensland cop cyclones. The bushland areas behind the coast, the ones that box the cities in, those catch fire regularly, catastrophically. The 2019-2020 Black Summer fires burned through over 17 million hectares. And then, just to keep things interesting, the floods roll in. Lismore. Remember Lismore? Flooded in 2022, then flooded again weeks later, then again. People were literally kayaking through their lounge rooms. Parts of southeast Queensland went under too. The Northern Rivers region became, well, actual rivers. And here's where it really bites. After each disaster, insurance premiums skyrocket, if you can even get covered at all. There are postcodes on the East Coast where home insurance costs $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a year. Some insurers have just straight up pulled out. Sorry, mate, we've assessed the risk and nah. So now you've got people paying a fortune to live in a place that nature keeps trying to reclaim, and then paying another fortune for the slim hope that someone will help them rebuild when it all goes sideways. Add climate change making these events more frequent and more intense, and you've got people seriously reconsidering whether the coastal lifestyle is worth the coastal risk. 6. The expectation gap is biggest here. The east coast of Australia sells a dream, a big, glossy, sun-drenched dream. Move to Sydney, you'll have the harbour, the beaches, the career, the lifestyle. Move to Melbourne, you'll have the culture, the food, the laneways, the footy. Move to Brisbane, you'll have the sunshine, the affordability, the laid-back vibes. And look, all of that stuff is real, sort of. It exists, it's there. But the thing is, it's there for people who can afford it. For a huge number of people who move to the East Coast, the reality looks nothing like the brochure. The reality is renting long-term with no path to ownership. The reality is financial stress that sits on your chest like a wet blanket. The reality is working yourself into the ground just to stay afloat with limited upward mobility and the constant nagging feeling that you're going backwards. And that gap, that slow-motion letdown, that's the thing that really breaks people, because it's not just disappointment. It's the slow, grinding realization that the deal you signed up for doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it did once, maybe your parents got it, but for you, the numbers don't work. Nobody moves to Wagga Wagga expecting harborside cocktails at sunset, but plenty of people move to Sydney expecting a life they'll never be able to afford. And that expectation gap, that slow-motion letdown, it hits harder on the East Coast than anywhere else in Australia, because the East Coast promises the most and delivers the least for ordinary people. 7. The mate's anchor is finally breaking. This is the invisible chain that kept people on the East Coast long after the logic said leave. Your mates are here. Your family's here, your local pub, your footy club, your Sunday barbecue crew. It's all here. And for years, that social gravity was enough to override the financial pain. People would cop the rent hikes, cop the commute, cop the insurance bills, because leaving meant leaving your people. But here's what's changed. Your mates are leaving too. That's the tipping point nobody talks about. When one person in your circle moves to the Sunshine Coast or Ballarat or Tassie, it's a novelty. You joke about them going bush. When 3 or 4 go, suddenly your Sunday barbecue crew is scattered across 3 states in a group chat. The anchor that held you isn't holding anymore because the thing it was anchored to has moved. And technologies close the gap. You're already talking to your mates through group chats and video calls half the time anyway. The difference between your best mate being 20 minutes across town and 3 hours away by plane is, in daily practical terms, about 1 fewer pub trip a month. That's it. You were already living a semi-remote friendship, you just hadn't admitted it yet. So the last emotional barrier, the one that kept people paying through the nose just to stay close to their people, that's dissolving. And once the social reason goes, there's genuinely nothing left holding people in place. Now look, it's easy to sit here and list problems all day. So what actually needs to happen? Well, for starters, Australia needs to stop treating the East Coast like it's the only place that matters. We need serious investment in regional infrastructure, not just a new roundabout in Bathurst and a pat on the back, but actual hospitals, fast internet, transport links, and job hubs in towns that already exist but have been neglected for decades. Decentralize the public service, move government departments out of Canberra and Sydney and into places like Townsville, Albury, or Geelong. Give companies tax incentives to set up headquarters outside the mega corridor instead of cramming another office tower into the CBD. Fast rail between regional centers and capital cities would be a game changer. Imagine living in Wollongong or Ballarat and being 45 minutes from the city on a proper train, not the rattler that stops at every paddock along the way. And housing policy needs to get real about density, zoning reform, and actually building social and affordable housing at scale instead of just talking about it at election time and then quietly shelving it. Remote work protections would help too. Give workers the legal right to request flexible arrangements so employers can't just drag everyone back to the office because a CEO misses seeing bums on seats. None of this is radical. Other countries are doing it. Australia just needs to stop pretending the East Coast can absorb infinite people and start building a country where you don't have to choose between a career and a life. So the bottom line, and it's simpler than you think, people aren't leaving the East Coast just because it's expensive. Expensive, people can handle, if the trade-off makes sense. Expensive but amazing? Sure, people will stretch. Expensive but worth it? They'll find a way. But expensive and exhausting, expensive and disaster-prone, expensive and congested, geographically boxed in, career competitive but financially stagnant, and wrapped in a lifestyle promise that most people can't actually access. That's when the equation breaks. That's when people sit down, look at the whole picture, and go, if I'm going to feel this squeezed, why am I still here? And once that question gets asked, really asked, the East Coast loses its biggest advantage. Because now remote work means you can earn from anywhere. Other states are rolling out the welcome mat, and suddenly leaving isn't giving up. It's the smartest move on the board. The East Coast of Australia is still beautiful, still vibrant, still one of the most spectacular stretches of coastline on the planet. But for a growing number of Aussies, loving a place and being able to live in it are two very different things. And that's why they're leaving. Are you still on the East Coast or did you get out? And if you got out, where did you end up? I'd love to hear it. Catch you in the next one. Cheers.